everyone. It's an honor for me to address this distinguished audience on the topic of religious freedom in Turkey. And the questions we'll be discussing over the next 2 days relate to the protection of religious freedom for all in Turkish constitution. What is the most successful arrangements to ensure that both the rights of the members of the minorities and the rights of the members of the majorities are protected? First, a very brief overview of my presentation. I will focus first on why the principle of neutrality and the obligation to ensure pluralism are important in this time in the context of Turkey. Then I will briefly go over some key normative demands of human rights law on state-religion relations to remind us all of the international norms that are applicable to Turkey. And lastly, the main part of my presentation will focus on Turkey and some of the freedom of religion or belief issues where the principle of neutrality and obligation to ensure pluralism are relevant and should be applied. So why focus on the principle of neutrality and the obligation to ensure pluralism today? Because in the context of the new constitution for Turkey, these are very relevant principles and hold fresh opportunities to advance protection of religious freedom for all. Turkey has been going through a process of change, including state-religion relationship, and the principles of neutrality and pluralism are two of the key norms that need to inform the decisions that are made in this process of change. Some indicators of this change are a new interpretation of secularism by the Turkish Constitutional Court, which it called liberal secularism, but then went on to justify state monopoly over religious education. A new way of relating to non-Muslim communities under the AK Party, the removal of the ban on the headscarf for public servants, change of the mission of the Presidency of Religious Affairs, increased state interest and involvement in the moral development of individuals, which always includes a religious dimension, including children, youth, and prisoners, and selective inclusion of religious practice and discourse in public events by senior public officials, including prayers in opening ceremonies. What I want to stress is that the more the decisions that lead to these changes take into account Turkey's human rights obligations in the sphere of religious freedom, the more Turkey will advance the protection of religious freedom for all. In Turkey, there is a unique state-religion relationship which has evolved over time with numerous factors affecting the process. It's a secular state protecting religious freedom in its constitution, yet this formula has not resulted in an effective protection of religious freedom for the majority and for the minorities. There are many paradoxes. There's the Presidency of Religious Affairs, the compulsory religious culture and morals lessons. The state continues to determine what is a worship place and what is an acceptable manifestation of religion or belief, and what is an acceptable title for a religious leader. Indeed, Turkey has a unique state-religion relationship that affects the protection of religious freedom. Yet Turkey is not alone. As we have heard previously about the different examples in the world, there are very variety of relationships between state and religion. Some strictly religious, some strictly secular, and many other varieties in between. However, normative demands derived from human rights obligations often challenge these historically evolved state-religion relations for all states, not only Turkey. Human rights law does not explicitly prescribe a certain state-religion relationship, but it also doesn't give states a blank check to do whatever they want to do. These obligations inevitably have implications on the manner in which state-religion relations are formulated. The principle of neutrality or obligation to ensure pluralism are important normative demands. However, let me point out in the beginning that these would not on their own ensure that religious freedom is protected effectively. It is important to remember that human rights are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible, and together establish a meaningful framework for the protection of human rights, including religious freedom. Let me briefly go over some of the normative demands that human rights law creates for states. And here I specifically focus on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, which are both applicable to Turkey. According to the Human Rights Committee, the fact that a religion is recognized as a state religion, or that it is established as official or traditional, or that its followers comprise the majority of the population, shall not result in any impairment of the enjoyment of any rights under the covenant, including religious freedom and protection of minorities. Non-discrimination is an important norm with far-reaching effects on the protection of freedom of religion or belief. An education system that would make religious instruction compulsory would be impermissible, because states have to respect the rights of parents to ensure that such education is in conformity with the philosophical or religious beliefs of parents. A theocratic state would be incompatible with the Article 9 protecting religious freedom under the ECHR. In San Marino, for example, where parliamentarians were required to take an oath on the Gospels in order to be able to take up their seats, this requirement was found to be a violation of Article 9. Where non-believers are required to pay for the taxes to support a state church, the European Commission found that this obligatory tax was incompatible with Article 9, and it would force someone who was not a member of the church to support the religious elements of that church. Pluralism goes hand in hand with democracy. The European Court of Human Rights held that pluralism is indissociable from a democratic society, and freedom of religion goes with it and depends on it. Therefore, the autonomous existence of belief communities must be ensured. The autonomous existence of belief communities is indispensable for pluralism in a democratic society, and is thus an issue at the very heart of the protection of human rights schemes. About neutrality, in exercising their regulatory powers in the religious spheres and in their relations with various religions or beliefs, states have a duty to remain neutral and impartial. And this duty of neutrality and impartiality, as defined by the European Court of Human Rights, is incompatible with any power on the state's part to assess the legitimacy of religious beliefs and their manifestations. Although there is not an explicit reference to neutrality in human rights conventions, ultimately this principle can be derived from these norms. We also don't find a definition of neutrality in the jurisprudence of human rights courts. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Heiner Bielefeld, says that neutrality is about fairness. State which is in charge of guaranteeing human rights should not favor any religion or belief, or one set of religions at the expense of another. And neutrality doesn't mean that the public space should be purged of religion or religious symbols. For some, state neutrality may be a myth. You may think it's very difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, we have to strive for it and aspire for these principles and acknowledge them as the norm that we use to assess state behavior by. And courts need to be able to hold states accountable for their commitment to neutrality. The Turkish constitution does not enshrine the principle of neutrality, or does not recognize equal distance to all religions, and does not include a provision respecting pluralism. The constitution drafting process was an opportunity to move forward in relation to the principle of neutrality and pluralism. In the constitution making process, religious communities have participated eagerly. Interestingly, when belief communities made their submissions to the Constitutional Reconciliation Commission, most of them refrained from making a reference to a secular state, and instead emphasized real equality, protection of the right to freedom of religion belief in line with European Convention on Human Rights, equal distance to all religions, pluralism, as well as neutrality. In my view, these legal terms present fresh opportunities to advance the protection of religious freedom in Turkey, because they are more specific and arguably they are more free from the sensitivities around the principle of secularism in the Turkish context. Unfortunately, the political parties were not able to reach a consensus on these principles. The Republican People's Party and the Peace and Democracy Party made a joint proposal on neutrality and pluralism in the context of freedom of religion or belief. It said, the state is neutral toward all religions and beliefs in its transactions and acts. State respects social pluralism based on the diversity of religions, beliefs, and convictions. This proposal was, however, rejected by the AK Party and the Nationalist Movement Party. These responses, however, seem inconsistent with the views of the society. A TESEV study found on the expectations on the Constitution found that about 70% of those interviewed said that they agree that the state should be neutral on the face of all freedoms, including the headscarf, sexual orientation, and other preferences.